Chapter 20. Later that day, as Jenna and her mother were in the driveway loading up the Explorer with bags of Charlie Ward's clothes, Annie Rico hit them with the news. She pulled right up to the curb in her Isuzu Trooper and announced she was on her way home from the pharmacy and just had to see how Jenna and her mother were doing, especially in light of the new developments. Jenna and her mother exchanged bewildered looks and an unspoken question. What new developments? But neither of them said a word. They did not want Annie Rico to think they weren't up on things, so they waited. And to think he's only 17, Annie said. She began to fidget with a car deodorizer, shaped like an evergreen tree that dangled from her rearview mirror. Still they waited, although Jenna was beginning to think she might have to pull Annie right out of the car and shake her by the shoulders if she didn't get to the point soon. It was obvious that Annie knew something important about the investigation. Meredith Ward smiled coolly. Yes, it's a shame. He's so young. Jenna had to admire her mother's finesse. She actually sounded as if she understood what Annie Rico was babbling on about. Of course, they haven't formally pressed charges. Annie adjusted her rearview mirror and studied her bleached hair for a minute, tucking in a few loose strands that had somehow avoided an earlier assault from a can of hairspray. But for heaven's sake, the police came right to his house and took him down to the station. They haven't done that with anyone else, so I'd have to say it doesn't look good for him. No, it doesn't, Meredith agreed. Well, keep me posted, Anna said, giving them a cheerful wave and steering her car away from the curb, as if Annie wouldn't know what was happening before anyone else, Jenna thought. Jenna grabbed her mother's arm and shook it. Mom, they caught him. We don't know that for sure. Her mother stared down at the bulging plastic bag at her feet. Then, without warning, she bolted for the house. Jenna was practically on her heels, but her mother returned to the front porch, cordless phone in hand, before Jenna made it through the door. She sat down on the top step next to her mother and listened impatiently as she talked to Chief Zielinski. The conversation on her mother's end gave Jenna few clues, but she could tell that her mother was furious because no one had contacted them. Annie Rico, she was shouting over the phone. We had to find out from Annie Rico. Can you imagine how we felt? When her mother finally pressed the off button 10 minutes later, Jenna could tell she was still upset. She hadn't seen her mother this angry in ages. Well, they caught him, didn't they? Jenna had to fight back the urge to grab her mother's arm again. They took someone in for questioning, that's all. Her mother's voice was flat. She leaned forward, elbows poised on her knees, her chin resting on in her hand. Dave Zielinski seemed annoyed that I even knew about it, she said. Can you believe that? He wanted to know how I'd found out. She flung her arms out. So I told him. And what does he say? He tells me they haven't arrested anyone. He said they were questioning a lot of people. It's routine. So they didn't catch him then. Jenna was disappointed. But even more than that, she was confused. I think they have a suspect, but they're not going to say anything until they're sure. So that's it? Her mother sighed. For now, anyway. Jenna picked up the cordless phone. I'm going to call Andrea, she announced, heading to the front door, although that wasn't her plan at all. She was about to call Annie Rico, and she knew that if her mother found out, she'd be grounded for life. But she was prepared to take that chance because she had to find out the boy's name. Annie Rico had said he was only 17. Jenna realized for the first time that this boy could be someone she knew. Up until now, her father's murderer had been a faceless monster. What if he turned out to be a monster with a familiar face? But as disturbing as that thought was, not knowing was even worse. She headed up to her room, phone book under her arm, and when Annie Rico answered, all Jenna said was, Do you know his name? There was a moment of silence, then Annie's gravelly voice floated back to her. Who is this? Sorry, Miss Rico, this is Jenna Ward. Oh, there was another pause. Whose name? Jenna squeezed her eyes shut. She hated this. Hated having to go to Annie Rico for information that should have been hers first. The boy the police took in for questioning, Jenna said. The police never told us his name. I thought maybe you'd know. Well, it just so happens I do. Jenna stood there, twisting her hair around her finger, waiting. Was Annie going to make her beg, for Pete's sake? Let me think now. I know his mother. She comes into the pharmacy a lot, Buys a lot of herbs and vitamins. Real big on that health stuff. Jenna was tapping her foot. What was this woman's problem? Ellen Sadowski. That's his mother. I think her youngest boy's name is Joe. Yes, that's it. Joe Sadowski. You know him? He probably goes to your school. No. Jenna breathed a sigh of relief, glad that the name wasn't familiar. As soon as she hung up, she began to flip through the telephone book again. Mrs. Rico had told them that the boy was the only person the police had actually taken to the station. That had to mean something. Jenna ran her fingers along one of the pages. There was only one Sadowski family listed. They lived on Maple Avenue, right in the four-block area that the police had been investigating. How soon till dinner? Jenna asked, sticking her head into the kitchen, where her mother was washing chicken parts. Her mother glanced up at the clock. An hour? Maybe. Depends on how long it takes to grill these. She held up a dripping wet chicken breast. Why? I'm going over to Andrea's, okay? Without waiting for an answer, she headed out the sliding glass door and cut across the backyard to Andrea's house, although she had no intention of stopping there. Once she was on Andrea's street, Jenna began to run. Joe Sadowski lived on the other side of town. That was over a mile, and she had only an hour before she had to be home. 33 Maple Avenue. Jenna looked across the street at the modest ranch house. Much of the blue paint had been scraped away, and one side had already been repainted a pale yellow. She leaned against one of the large maple trees that lined the street, watching the front door. She was hoping to get a glimpse of Joe Sadowski, although she had no idea what he looked like or what she would do if he suddenly came through the door. Just then, a boy rounded the corner walking fast. At first, she wondered if it was Joe. Then she realized with a shock that it was Michael Mackenzie. He took off running across the Sadowski's lawn, but for one brief moment he slowed his pace and looked across the street. She wondered if he had seen her. If he had, he gave no indication. He simply bounded up the front steps and rang the doorbell. Jenna stepped behind the large maple. Her heart was thumping wildly. What was Michael Mackenzie doing at Joe Sadowski's house? She knew they were both 17 and going to be seniors, but were they also friends? She peeked around the tree to see what was happening. She felt ridiculous, as if she were playing some childish spy game. But she didn't care. She had to know what was going on. She watched him as another boy, who she decided was Joe Sadowski, came to the door. At first she couldn't see him very well, but then he smacked the door open and stomped down the front steps, with Michael right behind him, and headed for the back of the house. It was happening. She was staring right into the face of her father's murderer. Jenna could see that he was furious about something. He looked, she thought with a shudder, as if he could kill someone. And in that moment she realized she had seen his face before. She recognized the rolled-up bandana he wore tied around his head. This was the boy who had been harassing Amy Ruggiero at Judd Passarello's party. Jenna pulled back behind the tree to avoid being seen, then hid there until the two boys were out of sight. Michael, Amy, Joe, did they all know each other? She rested her forehead against the tree and closed her eyes. So what if they did? Did that really surprise her? After all, Briarwood was a small town. Lives invariably collided, jostling other lives. She was thoroughly disgusted with herself. She wasn't doing a thing, just standing there, staring, her thick lashes spiked with tears. She thought of her violent outburst at the beach, of Andrea's shock, of her conviction that she would confront her father's murderer, and then, without remorse, point a gun in his face and fire. That had been a fantasy. This person, this boy across the street from her, was real. She knew now that no matter how much pain he had caused her, no matter how much she hated him, she would never be able to pull that trigger. Jenna peeled the skin from the chicken leg and picked at the meat. The last thing she felt like doing was eating, haunted by images of Joe Sadowski and Michael Mackenzie. All she wanted was to get to the bottom of things. She wondered what Michael Mackenzie had been doing at Joe's. What, if anything, was his part in all this? Her mother sat across the kitchen table from her, grinding coarse pepper onto her salad. She seemed equally preoccupied. She had barely said a word to Jenna since Jenna had returned. Jenna suspected she had the investigation on her mind too. Jenna thought about calling Andrea to tell her what she'd found out, but realized that linking Michael McKenzie with her father's murderer, if that was who Joe Sadowski was, would just upset her friend. There was no point in telling Andrea, not until Jenna had something concrete anyway. "What's going to happen to the boy who shot Dad?" she said. "I don't know." Her mother was staring off into space, her eyes focused on some imaginary place over Jenna's head. "I don't want to see his life ruined. I mean, I realize what happened was an accident, and there's been enough pain already, don't you think? He's going to have to live with this for the rest of his life. I just want to know what happened, that's all, for my own peace of mind." "Will he go to prison?" "We don't even know if the boy they took in for questioning is the same person who fired the shot," her mother reminded her. But if he is, then I guess that will depend on whether it ever comes to trial. They'll probably present it to a grand jury," her mother said, "when they have enough evidence, if they ever find any evidence." "Well, if they do, if he's found guilty, his sentence will depend on the judge. It could be suspended, or he might have to do community service." Her mother paused. "Or he could go to prison." Jenna wiped the barbecue sauce from her sticky fingers onto her napkin. Wasn't that what she wanted? To have this boy behind bars? She stared down at her half-eaten dinner. No matter what, if he'd killed her father, he was going to have to pay for what he'd done. "I think I'll go for a walk. I think I'll go work on a few math problems," Jenna told her mother, getting up from the table. "Math problems? In the summer?" Jenna shrugged. "School starts in a few days." It wasn't much of a reason, but she didn't feel like explaining that she sometimes used math problems to calm her thoughts. A cool September breeze played with the pages of her algebra book as she lay in the hammock by the pool. The days were growing shorter, and already the sun had disappeared behind the treetops. Balancing the book on her raised knees, one arm pressed across the page to keep it from turning, she began to work on the first problem. She was counting on math to distract her from thinking about Joe Sadowski, but that wasn't happening. In fact, the questions that ran through her mind were more insistent than ever, for whenever she pictured Joe, she also saw Amy, and she found the connection disturbing. Jenna stared down at a complex algebra problem without actually seeing it. Then it came to her. There was one common link in all this confusion, one person who just might have some answers for her: Amy Ruggiero.